In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
In the Hebrew Bible reading for tonight, we're given the account of the origins of Jesus' last meal with his disciples. And the story in Exodus is set against the backdrop of the enslavement and then eventual liberation of the Hebrew people from their enslavement in Egypt. In many ways, Exodus 12 is the culmination of much of what has gone before, the tipping point through which the people were finally saved. Earlier, God had spoken to Moses in a burning bush, telling him to go to Pharaoh and to tell Pharaoh to let God's people go. Pharaoh refused, and plague after plague rained down upon the people of Egypt. Pharaoh's heart, however, continually was hardened until we reach this moment, the 10th and final plague, the one that will break Pharaoh's will and terrify the people of Egypt enough to let their slaves go free. God says to Moses, "I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both human beings and animals." 4 days before this death and destruction in the final plague, the people are told to take a new spring lamb for each family. If a family is too small to eat an entire lamb, they shall join with the neighbor who lives closest to them and share the lamb. They're to inspect the lamb daily, ensuring it has no blemishes. Then on the 14th day of the month at twilight, each household is to slaughter the lamb, taking the blood and putting it on the doorpost and lintel of each house. Then they are to roast the lamb whole and eat it together that very night. They're instructed to eat it dressed, ready to go, shoes on their feet, staff in their hand. And they have to eat the whole thing that night or burn whatever is left over before morning comes. Because when morning comes, every Egyptian household will wake up to death. And Pharaoh, in grief and terror, will release the enslaved Hebrew people. This climactic story, the pinnacle of the Exodus narrative, continues as the people are then set free. Moses leads them out, and when Pharaoh changes his mind and sends his army after the fleeing slaves, the groups come together at the Red Sea, the border of the Egyptian nation. God parts the waters of the sea so that the Hebrews can walk through on dry land, but then when the Egyptian army tries to follow them, God sends the waters crashing down upon the army, killing them all. And on the other side of the sea, finally free from hundreds of years of Egyptian bondage, Moses and his sister Miriam sing songs of praise to God, drawing the whole story to a close and turning to the next chapter, their journey through the wilderness. In our reading for tonight, when God gives these instructions for this sacred meal, he tells the people that generations to come will remember this moment of salvation by reenacting a late-night meal, ate hurriedly and on the run, on the cusp of being liberated, but while death is passing through the streets to make that liberation possible. And the Passover meal became one of the major feasts in the Jewish religion, the name itself, Passover, referring to how the angel of death passed over the Hebrew households, even as it wrought destruction and death upon the Egyptian ones. In fact, the meal continued actually to be celebrated as a household experience of worship, until the time came that they constructed the tabernacle, the tent where God's presence would dwell, in the wilderness. And at that point, the lamb would be slaughtered at the entrance of the tabernacle and then taken home to be consumed. No longer then would blood be placed on the doorposts either. And then later, when the temple was constructed in Jerusalem, all families would journey to Jerusalem for this day, sacrificing their lamb at the temple and then taking it back home or to wherever they were staying that night to eat it and to remember how God saved God's people in the midst of death. The reason, of course, we have the story of the Passover meal on Maundy Thursday is because it is in the context of this meal that Jesus and his disciples gather in the upper room. If you remember from the other gospel narratives, Jesus sends his disciples to find a room, and they encounter one where everything is ready for them to make the final preparations to eat the sacred Passover meal, to remember how God saved the people when death was all around them. But then in the midst of that meal, Jesus transforms the Passover by blessing bread and wine and telling his disciples that this bread is now his body. And this wine is now his blood, all of which is given for the salvation of the world. And so it's actually rather interesting that we are giving the reading from John on Maundy Thursday for the gospel text. Because one of the most significant differences between John's gospel and the other gospels is that the other gospels have Jesus eating the Passover meal with his disciples. But if you were paying attention to the gospel reading, you heard that the meal described in John occurs the night before the festival of the Passover. That is because John structures his narrative so that the day on which Christ is killed is the exact same day when those lambs were killed in the temple, making Jesus quite literally the new Passover Lamb. Now, it's difficult. It's profoundly difficult on this holy night to be separated from one another. To be separated from our church building, and especially to be separated from the sacrament of Eucharist, from Christ's body and blood, which are such an integral part of our Maundy Thursday experience. Because traditionally, this is the last Eucharistic meal eaten before our liberation as well. The last night we celebrate Holy Eucharist, eat the body and drink the blood, before the dark specter of death arises once more like it did in those streets in Egypt and murders Jesus, only for that death to be overcome by his love and divine power as he rises from the dead on the third day and liberates us, just like those Hebrew slaves so long ago. It's difficult, but there's also a profound connection offered to us on this night. After all, remember that the original Passover was not celebrated at the temple. It was celebrated in homes. People were not even allowed to gather in one another's household as friends and family, lest attention be drawn to the Hebrews in this time of death. Only if you couldn't eat a whole lamb would you be able to join with someone else. But then the text says you've got to just join with your closest neighbor. Not your friend, not your family, just the person living next door to you, so that there will be enough people to eat the whole lamb. The Passover was a meal eaten while God's people were also separated from one another, while they were told that salvation was coming but were surrounded by death. And in Jesus' time, the Lord's Supper was not instituted in a worship service. Rather, it was once more a meal eaten in darkness with Jesus and his friends, away from family, just 13 people gathered in a room, while all around them forces of violence and death rose against Jesus and his followers. So you and I, gathered in our separate households on this night, are perhaps more connected to the origins of Holy Eucharist than we ever have been. We are reminded that the origins of our salvation was isolation and death. But we are also reminded that in the end, God will triumph over isolation and death. In the end, people who are willing to be committed to Christ's way of love, a love that always asks what I can give up in order to save others, will always triumph over selfishness and power and death. Which is why, of course, tonight we wash one another's feet. Because we were saved because Jesus loved us more than he loved even his own life. And so before being killed for his disciples who would deny and betray him, Jesus knelt and washed each one of their feet, even Judas's. And when we wash feet on Maundy Thursday, we remember that the Blessed Sacrament doesn't exist just to give us peace and joy, The sacrament exists to nourish us so that we can be people of service, people of sacrificial love in this world. We wash feet tonight, knowing the day will come when we will share in the Eucharistic feast once more. We wash feet tonight, isolated and with death at the door, knowing that whenever God's people find themselves in this place, salvation is also at hand, if we have eyes to see it. Our job until that salvation arrives is to get on our knees and serve one another and this world for which Christ died. Amen.